A real-life Transylvanian fortress tied to the legend of Dracula, as well as some terrifying ghost stories, a French villa whose streets are roamed by the dead after dark, and an English landmark that is internationally famous for its ridiculously disturbing paranormal activity await on this journey through some of the most haunted castles on Earth. Are you ready to get started? Our first haunt takes us to the heartland of Romania and on a tour of the absolutely iconic Bran Castle. Bran Castle stands above the village of Bran in Transylvania, Romania, its towers and battlements rising from the rocky outcrop like a fortress shaped by centuries of conflict, culture, and myth. Historically, the first stone version of the castle was commissioned in 1377 by King Louis I of Hungary and was built by the Saxons of the nearby Kronstadt to protect a strategically important mountain pass between Transylvania and Wallachia and to act as a customs post for merchants and travelers alike. In its early centuries, Bran played a real military role defending against Ottoman incursions in the 15th century, withstanding sieges and serving as a point of transit and control for armies and traders. And over time, its defensive function gave way to more domestic identities, including as a royal residence in the early 20th century when it was gifted to Queen Marie of Romania after World War I and was extensively renovated to suit her tastes. This castle has weathered the upheavals of the 20th century, royal use, wartime hospital service under Princess Ileana, seizure by the communist regime in 1948, and eventual restitution in the early 2000s, before it was opened as a museum that showcases both its martial past and its cultural significance to the nation. From the outside, Bran is inseparable from the myth of Dracula, a connection that has drawn countless visitors to its narrow stairways and shadowed corridors, and this association, rooted in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula, does not rest on direct historical ties. In fact, the Irish author never even visited the castle, and evidence of Vlad Tepes, a historical figure who inspired the vampire legend, residing there is limited at the very best. Stoker's descriptions of Castle Dracula align in atmosphere with Bran's dramatic setting atop a rocky hill and its gothic silhouette against the Carpathian peaks, which helped popularize the aforementioned association in the 20th century, as tourists and tour guides alike embraced the moniker Dracula's Castle. Now, inside its thick walls and winding passageways, tales of lingering presences have followed visitors for generations. Among the most recounted is the legend of the castle's White Lady, a spectral figure said to be the spirit of a noble woman whose life ended in sorrow within, and witnesses claim to see her in a flowing white gown drifting through dimly lit halls or standing near windows from which the Transylvanian landscape spreads out below, her face marked by centuries of loss and longing. Notably, these sightings often occur when the castle is the most quiet, just after the crowds thin and the last echoing footsteps fade from its flagstone corridors. Another story speaks of a monk who was locked alive within its walls as punishment that was whispered about in local lore and tied to the castle's medieval past. This monk was sealed into a hidden chamber for defying authority or for guarding a forbidden relic. Though no official record confirms this incident, visitors have described faint murmurs and footsteps in galleries where no one else is walking, as though the monk's final pacing persists in an unseen afterlife. Beyond these specific figures, the castle's atmosphere has been described as thick with echoes, unexplained footsteps that fall into silence, soft phantom voices that dissolve into the stone before their source is found, and sudden chills that descend without notice. Some visitors report a breath of cold air at the back of the neck as they round corners, or the sensation of being watched just out of sight in a doorway framed by shadow and age-worn wood. These experiences do not announce themselves with spectacle, but rather with the subtle insistence of history making itself known. Today, Bran Castle is a museum of medieval defense and royal life, its rooms filled with artifacts, period furniture, and exhibits that reflect its layered past. Yet for many who traverse its staircases as dusk settles in, the sense lingers that the castle holds more than just history on its stone. There is a quiet pull to the battlements after sunset, a feeling of hidden stories, both real and imagined, that remain forever woven into its very structure, waiting for the light to fade so they can be heard once more. Our second haunt takes us northwest to Germany and has us braving the infamous Eltz Castle. Eltz Castle, known locally as Burg Eltz, rises above the Eltzbach Valley near Wiersham, Germany, a medieval fortress that has stood for more than 8 centuries without ever being destroyed, and has remained in the possession of the same family since it was first recorded in 1157 or so. The earliest stone fortifications at the site were built at the beginning of the 12th century, erected along a vital trade route linking the Moselle River with the lands beyond, and the name Eltz appeared in a deed signed by Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa in 1157, where Rudolf von Eltz is named as a witness anchoring the family's presence in documented history. From these early foundations, the castle grew slowly and deliberately, its towers and residences shaped by centuries of expansion rather than replacement, and it was nearly completely surrounded on 3 sides by the river below, creating a naturally defensible spur of rock, a position that would help preserve it through centuries of conflict that leveled other strongholds across the region. By 1277, the castle had taken on an unusual form. The Eltz estate was divided amongst 3 branches of the family, each of which constructed their own residential houses within the shared fortress. This arrangement, known as a Gnerbenberg, resulted in a dense vertical complex of living spaces clustered around a central courtyard, where multiple households lived side by side under a single defensive perimeter. That fragile balance was tested beginning in 1331 during the conflict known as the Eltz feud, when the family resisted the expansion of Archbishop Balduin of Trier. Balduin would construct a rival fortress, Trutzeltz Castle, and would subject Eltz to a prolonged siege using early artillery. Rather than ending in destruction, the conflict concluded through negotiation, with the Eltz family acknowledging Trier's authority rather than retaining their ancestral home. And over the following centuries, the castle continued to expand. The Rubinach House was completed in 1472, followed by the Rodendorf House, and in the 16th century, the Kempenich House was also added, and was notable for being among the first parts of the castle to feature consistent heating. These additions layered Romanesque Gothic and later architectural elements into a single structure that reflects uninterrupted occupation. Among the many legends and ghost stories preserved with Eltz, one particular story has endured more powerfully than any other. In the mid-1500s, a noblewoman named Agnes Eltz became central to one of the castle's most enduring legends. Agnes had been promised in marriage to a knight from Braunsberg, a political union intended to strengthen alliances between the families, but she openly resisted this match, and according to tradition, during a celebration on the eve of the planned marriage, the knight attempted to force a kiss upon her, and Agnes responded by striking him across the face and rejecting him publicly in front of all assembled guests. Humiliated, the knight departed in fury, issuing threats before leaving the castle. Now, everyone at Eltz had all but forgotten the incident, until months later, while many of the Eltz men were away, the Knight of Braunsberg returned with armed forces, intent on seizing Agnes and avenging his dishonor. Faced with an unexpected assault, however, Agnes took command. She ran to her brother's room and donned his armor, seized a battle axe, and rallied loyal servants and retainers to defend the castle. Contemporary versions of this legend describe her fighting fiercely on the battlements and within the courtyard, rallying troops and striking down attackers while holding the line as long as she possibly could. Unfortunately, however, in the chaos of the battle, the Braunsberg knight loosed an arrow that struck Agnes square in the chest, resulting in her death. When he approached this unknown knight and lifted their visor, he realized all too late that he had actually slain the woman he had once sought to claim. Agnes's death galvanized the defenders. The attackers were overwhelmed, and the Knight of Braunsberg fled the castle, never to be seen again. Now, while some versions of the legend claim he was hunted down or died in obscurity, and others leave his fate unresolved, I like to think something somewhere just in between. Now, Agnes's armor and weapons are preserved within the castle, her breastplate visibly damaged where the fatal blow landed. In the years that followed, the room where these items were displayed gained a reputation for unexplained activity. Visitors have reported strange noises, sudden cold, flickering lights, and a heavy sense of presence, particularly after the castle has closed for the day. But Agnes is not the only spectral figure associated with Eltz's lingering presence, and both staff and visitors have also described seeing a figure near the castle entrance late at night, pacing as if standing watch, while others speak of a phantom rider on horseback appearing near the gate in the early hours before dawn, a silent silhouette that vanishes just as soon as it's noticed. Additionally, footsteps echo through the empty corridors long after tours have ended, and cold air settles in armories and narrow passageways where no drafts should ever reach. These reports are often considered personal, and are usually experienced individually rather than collectively, giving them the character of one-on-one encounters rather than a spectacle. Because Eltz Castle was never destroyed, never abandoned, and never rebuilt, its very past feels unusually intact. Objects remain where they were placed generations past. Walls still bear the marks of lived-in spaces rather than reconstructed museums or displays. And the site functions today as an educational venue of medieval life and family continuity. But as evening approaches and the shadows deepen in the valley below, the separation between history and presence becomes harder to define. For Eltz does not feel like a place where something returned. It feels like a tomb where nothing ever really fully left. And on to number 3, which takes us southwest to France and into the tidal coastal village of Mont Saint-Michel. Mont Saint-Michel rises from the tidal flats of Normandy as a structure shaped as much by water as it is by stone. And before you guys say it, while this one is technically a lot more than a castle, it is an awesome fortified village on an island. And if that doesn't earn it a spot on this list, I just don't know what does. At high tide, the Mount becomes an island, completely severed from the mainland by fast-moving currents that can rise with lethal speed. At low tide, the surrounding sands stretch outward, calm in appearance but treacherous beneath the surface. Now, long before the abbey crowned the summit, the rock itself held great spiritual significance, and Celtic peoples regarded the Mount as a sacred ground, associated with death and transition, a place where the boundary between worlds felt thinner. And this association with separation and passage would define Mont Saint-Michel long before its first walls were ever raised. According to early medieval tradition, the transformation of the mount into a Christian site began in 708, when the archangel Michael appeared repeatedly to Bishop Albert of Aranches, instructing him to build a sanctuary atop the rock. Albert initially resisted these visions until, according to legend, the final apparition left a physical mark on his skull, forcing compliance. Construction began soon after, and the first church was consecrated in 709. From its earliest days, Mont Saint-Michel was meant to be difficult to reach, and pilgrims timed their journeys carefully, crossing the sands while watching the tide, knowing that mistakes could mean drowning or being swallowed alive by the mud. By the 10th century, Benedictine monks had established a permanent abbey on the summit, and Mont Saint-Michel became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in Europe, with its reputation drawing travelers from across the continent, many of whom recorded their journey as physically exhausting and psychologically taxing. Expansion followed steadily, and through the 11th and 12th centuries, Romanesque and later Gothic structures were built directly into the rock, stacking crypts, chapels, cloisters, refectories, and dormitories upwards rather than outwards. Daily life at Mont Saint-Michel demanded constant ascent and descent along narrow stairways carved into the stone. And even during this early monastic period, some pilgrims wrote of hearing voices carried on the winds that did not belong to their companions, and of footsteps echoing behind them while climbing the interior staircases, and of turning only to find themselves alone. The abbey's role shifted dramatically during the 100 Years' War, beginning in 1337, when Mont Saint-Michel was heavily fortified and became both a religious symbol and a military stronghold. English forces would attempt to take the mount repeatedly but failed over and over again, and were defeated as much by the tides as they were by the site's defenses. Soldiers were stationed alongside monks, and vigilance replaced contemplation. Guards maintained night watches along the ramparts, often isolated by fog, wind, rain, and darkness. And it was during this era era that some of the earliest persistent reports of unexplained activity appear in written accounts and later oral tradition, with guards describing footsteps pacing behind them during watches that stop abruptly when they turn, and bells heard during violent storms when no services were scheduled, their rings thin and distorted beneath the wind and surf. Following centuries of religious use, Mont Saint-Michel entered its most brutal chapter during the French Revolution. In 1793, the abbey was secularized and converted into a state prison. Its monks were expelled, sacred spaces dismantled, and cells constructed within former chapels and crypts. And henceforth, prisoners referred to the site as the Bastille of the Sea. Men and women were confined in damp, lightless rooms, often chained while the tides erased any sense of escape below. And letters and later memoirs describe overwhelming despair, with several prisoners reporting chanting heard late at night despite no monks remaining on the mount, and others telling of shadowy figures standing at the ends of staircases, motionless, watching without speaking. Additionally, some inmates claim that during storms they heard footsteps pacing above their cells long after guards had withdrawn. This prison would finally close in 1863, and by the late 19th century, Mont Saint-Michel was designated a historic monument. Restoration work would begin, bringing caretakers, stonemasons, and archivists into areas long sealed or neglected. It was during this period that new reports emerged, separate from folklore. Workers described tools being moved overnight, doors found unlocked that had been secured the evening before, and cold air settled into old crypts regardless of the season. Several even reported sudden pressure in their chests while ascending narrow stairways, a sensation that only lifted once they'd reached open air. And voices have been heard in empty corridors, low and rhythmic, resembling prayers spoken too softly to understand. Through the 20th century, as Mont Saint-Michel reopened fully to visitors, reports continued from those who remained after closing hours. One recurring account involves a monk seen walking through the cloister or refectory late at night and moving with deliberate, practiced steps. This figure does not acknowledge witnesses and vanishes when followed. Another phenomenon is tied to the prison era rather than the monastic one, and many staff members have described hearing the sounds of chains being dragged along stone floors in the lower levels, particularly right near former cells, even though no such objects remain there today. The most unsettling reports come from those assigned to close the abbey at night, where multiple individuals across different decades have described hearing measured footsteps ascending the interior staircases after the building has been locked up. These steps are slow, evenly spaced, and unmistakably human, and they always climb for several seconds, pause, and then begin again, stopping just short of the upper levels. When investigated, no one is ever found, and the sound does not flee or fade, it simply ends, as though whoever was climbing the stairs reached a destination that no longer exists. Number 4 takes us directly north into Scotland to the prestigious Edinburgh Castle. Edinburgh Castle dominates the skyline of Scotland's capital, rising from the sheer volcanic rock of Castle Rock, a position that has been strategically occupied for more than 1,000 years. Historically, archaeological evidence suggests human presence on the rock in as early as the Iron Age, but the site's actual recorded history begins in earnest by the 12th century, when it became a royal stronghold under King David I. From its earliest days, the castle functioned as both a military fortress and a symbol of authority, looming over the growing city below. Its elevation was not symbolic alone. It offered command of the surrounding land, marking it as one of the most contested sites in Scottish history. Throughout the medieval period, Edinburgh Castle changed hands repeatedly as Scotland's political landscape shifted. It served as a royal residence, as an armory, and as a refuge during times of war, and it played a central role during the Wars of Scottish Independence in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, switching control multiple times between Scottish and English forces. Siege warfare became routine, and the castle was attacked, reclaimed, sabotaged from within, and reinforced over and over again. One of its most famous recaptures occurred in 1314, when a small group of Scottish soldiers scaled the rock face under cover of darkness and retook the fortress from English control. These cycles of violence left the castle densely layered with trauma long before it gained a reputation for hauntings. By the 16th century, Edinburgh Castle had become inseparable from the machinery of the Scottish crown. It housed the honours of Scotland, the crown jewels, and served as a prison for political enemies and captured soldiers. In 1566, Mary, Queen of the Scots, gave birth to her son James VI within castle walls, anchoring the site firmly in royal legacy. Even as it hosted royalty, the castle remained a place of confinement and punishment, and prisoners there were held in dark vaults beneath the Great Hall, some for years at a time, often in conditions designed to break both body and will. It was during the 17th century, when the castle's role as a prison was expanded, that the earliest ghost stories tied to specific locations began emerging. Prisoners held in the vaults reported hearing voices in neighboring cells that fell silent when answered. Guards spoke of footsteps echoing through passageways long after rounds were completed, and some prisoners claimed they could hear scratching inside the walls themselves, as though the stone had absorbed the desperation of those confined within it. These accounts were dismissed as the effects of stress and isolation, yet they persisted across decades in different groups of inmates. The castle's most notorious period followed in the 18th century, when it became a major holding site for prisoners of war during conflicts with France, Spain, and later the American colonies. Hundreds of captives were crammed into underground vaults, many suffering from disease, starvation, and psychological collapse, and records describe prisoners carving messages and symbols into the walls, some of which that remain visible to this day. It is from this era that one of Edinburgh Castle's most unsettling figures is said to originate, a headless drummer boy. According to tradition, this boy was sent to explore the castle's underground passages shortly before an attack and never returned. Sightings of the ghostly drummer begin appearing in accounts shortly after, often described as an omen, with witnesses reporting hearing the steady beat of a drum echoing through the castle, sometimes followed by the brief appearance of the boy himself, moments before periods of upheaval or violence. By the 19th century, as the castle transitioned from an active fortress into a national monument and military installation, reports became more formal. Soldiers stationed at the castle wrote of strange occurrences during night watches. One sentry reportedly fled his post after encountering a silent figure advancing towards him through the fog, vanishing just before reaching the sentry box. And another described hearing distant music drifting through the grounds when no ceremonies were taking place. These reports were often recorded reluctantly, included in logs as unexplained disturbances rather than folklore. The castle's extensive underground network has generated its own body of supernatural reports. Through the late 18th century, sections of Edinburgh's underground vaults were sealed and forgotten, and when exploration resumed decades later, volunteers sent into the tunnels described sudden drops in temperature, feelings of panic, and the sensation of being touched or followed by multiple unseen presences. One explorer even claimed to have encountered a small boy who held his hand and guided him through the darkness, only for the child to disappear when the man emerged into the light. Subsequent accounts from different expeditions describe similar encounters, often involving children who appear briefly and then vanish without a trace. Edinburgh Castle remains active today as a historic site, military presence, and national symbol, and thousands of people walk its grounds daily, most unaware that some spaces they move through once served as execution sites, as prisons, and as siege platforms. Staff working after hours continue to report footsteps in locked areas, voices carried on the wind across the esplanade, sudden sensations of being watched from above, and claims from the vaults that air shifts without warning, pressing in as though the space itself is resisting intrusion. One of the most persistent modern reports comes from the castle's interior corridors late at night, where multiple staff members have independently described hearing slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from behind while walking alone. This sound does not rush, but it doesn't retreat either. It keeps near perfect pace, matching each step until the witness stops, at which point the phantom footsteps stop as well. Now, whenever someone's turned around, the corridor is always completely empty, and the sound never resumes. It simply ends, leaving the unmistakable impression that something was following rules learned long ago, within walls that have never forgotten how to contain the living. Saving the spookiest for last, our fifth and final haunt has us traveling south to the heart of England to explore the grand halls of one of the scariest places on earth, being Chillingham Castle. Chillingham Castle stands in the rolling countryside of Northumberland in England, a medieval fortress whose stone walls have seen more bloodshed, power struggles, and sorrow than almost any other stronghold in Britain. The origins of the castle trace back to the 12th century when a monastery once occupied the site, and its sacred ground was later fortified in response to Scottish incursions and border warfare. By the 13th century, a proper castle was established, its quadrangular form and four-corner towers shaping a formidable defense structure that would weather centuries of conflict, upheaval, and political maneuvering. Positioned close to the turbulent Anglo-Scottish border, Chillingham's walls became both refuge and prison, hosting kings, resisting sieges, and witnessing the tragedies of warfare that would leave marks not only in the history books, but many believe in something far less tangible. Through the Middle Ages, Chillingham Castle was heavily involved in the border feuds that defined northern England, and its lords were often embroiled in skirmishes, sieges, and political alliances that shifted with the fortunes of kings. In 1298, King Edward I of England, known widely as Hammer of the Scots, stayed at Chillingham while campaigning against William Wallace and his Scottish forces, underscoring the castle's strategic importance. And over the centuries, it remained a symbol of military authority, surviving attacks and internal division, while serving as a seat of power for families such as the Greys and later the Earls of Tankerville. Amid this violent and stormy history, the castle's role as a site of incarceration and punishment became increasingly pronounced. Prisoners of war, rebels, and captives were held deep within the fortress's hidden dungeons and chambers, spaces that later visitors and staff describe as bearing the psychological weight of confinement. The torture chamber, long exhibited with grim instruments of cruelty, is an ongoing reminder that physical torment was once commonplace within these walls, and it's in these same corridors and vaults that many of Chillingham's reported hauntings have their roots. Perhaps the most famous of the castle's spectral residents is the figure known as the Radiant Boy, or sometimes as the Blue Boy, a childish wraith associated with the pink room inside of the castle. Now, for years, visitors and residents reported hearing the boy's cries of fear or pain around midnight, followed by sightings of a small, glowing figure dressed in blue drifting through the chamber. And some accounts describe a bright flash emanating from thick walls and a halo of light approaching those who slept in the room as the lament faded. During renovations in the early 20th century, bones believed to belong to a child, encased in fragments of blue cloth, were actually discovered within the wall right near where the sightings occurred. After the remains were given a Christian burial, reports of the Blue Boy subsided, temporarily at least, only to return years later, according to some guests and staff. Another presence tied deeply to the castle's history is that of the ghost of Lady Berkeley, the wife of Lord Grey, whose personal tragedy unfolded within the castle's walls. Abandoned by her husband, who ran off with her sister, Lady Berkeley was left alone with her infant child in a place where loyalty and lineage were matters of life and death, and witnesses over the years have described hearing the soft rustle of her dress as she moves through the rambling corridors, her pace searching rather than aimless, as though she continues to seek the husband who never returned to her. These sightings are often accompanied by sudden drops in temperature and an oppressive chill that seems to follow her passage. The castle's torture chamber and dungeons have their own array of reports, some of which derive from the violent hands of men like John Sage, a torturer associated with the site in local lore. Legendary for his merciless methods against captured Scots, Sage's presence is said to linger around the corridor leading to the chambers, sometimes described as a faceless figure dragging something unseen along the floor, or as a cold presence that settles near the display of medieval restraints and racks. Later, Sage would face his own execution, and it's said that a riled-up crowd, angry over the violent way in which he conducted his work, went to town on him by way of cutting things off. And I mean things that aren't immediately fatal. As some tell it, by the time they were done, John was still alive and was little more than a torso with a head, while others claim the crowd didn't touch his fingers, toes, arms, or legs, but other appendages. Whatever the case, after dark, some have told they can hear the screams of Sage echoing into the future. These echoes are not subtle. They are sudden gusts of chill followed by a heavy weighted silence that witnesses often describe as a void rather than a stillness. Chillingham's chapel and pantry are themselves stages for other hauntings. Within the old pantry, a white lady is said to appear, her figure seen gliding between shelves long after the last visitors have left, while others have reported hearing whispering voices in the chapel. personal that don't belong to any tour group or recording, but seem to respond to intrusions into the sacred space with short phrases or emotional annotations that evade understanding. The castle's ghost tours, offered throughout the years, lean into these reports, guiding brave visitors through corridors and rooms where chilling activity is said to cluster more densely. Beyond these named apparitions, Chillingham Castle seems to have a broader habit of unsettling contact, and visitors and staff alike report cold spots that appear without shift in weather, doors that open and close when no one is nearby them, and disembodied footsteps echoing through passages that should be empty. Skeptics often point to the castle's thick stone walls, irregular drafts, and acoustics, but those who have spent hours after dark within the fortress describe a different pattern. Interactions that seem purposeful rather than random, as though something unseen is responding to the presence itself. One of the most persistent and eerie phenomena reported by guides and other night tour participants involves movement in the corridors near the old dungeons after the castle has closed. Witnesses describe hearing heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing just beyond the range of candlelight, advancing quickly and then slowly retreating without visibility of any physical form. Unlike smaller, fleeting sensations of pressure or whispers, these footsteps appear rhythmic and intentional, often stopping abruptly just as tour groups or caretakers reach the entryway to the space. And some say it sounds like someone walking around in armored boots, a sound that carries with it a weight that no ordinary visitor could replicate in silence. For many, Chillingham Castle's hauntings are inseparable from its brutal past, a fortress where blood was shed, where children were lost, where love turned to despair, and where prisoners lingered in darkness far too long. Walking through its chambers, one is confronted by the sense that the castle's history was not only recorded in stone and timber, but in something less visible, preserved in the very patterns of sound and stillness residents and visitors have reported for generations. For in the deep quiet that falls after dusk, and with only the crackle of candlelight and the distant echo of boots on stone, Chillingham reminds those who linger that the restless shadows of its past very much continue to move in our world. Thanks for joining me on this journey through some of the most haunted castles on Earth. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and hauntings, subscribe to my channel, throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone you feel could use a good scare. I'll catch you all next time.